Hi everyone. Today I'm going to reply to a question about psychotherapy and spiritual bypass. But before doing so, if you're new to the channel, and I know we have a lot of new subscribers, you may be interested in dipping into a couple of my books that deal with these topics in more detail than is possible in a YouTube video. You don't have to buy anything. Extended excerpts from both books are available on my webpage, and there'll be links in the description. So the question today comes from Monica Farrell, and she says this: Robert, I would love for you to talk more about awake, quotation marks awake, emotional pain and empathy, and using so-called spiritual, non-dual, or meditative paths as bypass, or sticking your head in the sand when facing emotional pain. I guess I'm asking if your awake perspective enlightens your psychological perspective, that is, your profession in therapy. Okay. The word awake is difficult. It means many things to different people. So before getting to the relationship between what I call awake and doing psychotherapy and what is spiritual bypass anyway, let me touch on what I mean by awake. It's not really complicated. What I mean by awake is understanding that what we human beings know is very small. What we know about ultimate matters is practically zero, if not zero. So that all of this talk about gods and universal consciousness and love and the rest of it is a point of view, not a set of facts. That's part of being awake. The other part, which is equally important, or if not even more important perhaps, is that all of this that we experience as myself or life or the world is not being produced by a myself, but is arising systemically from where we know not. That's a hard one to grasp, because most of us feel as if we need to do something, or that something else needs to happen. Otherwise, things as they are not satisfactory, or problematical, or too painful, or too confusing. This is a message that the Buddha put forth 2,500 years ago by saying that life was dukkha. Now that's been translated as life is suffering, but dukkha does not really mean suffering in the sense of actual pain, psychic or bodily. It means a feeling of unsatisfactoriness, that there's something about this life that's unsatisfactory. And that feeling of unsatisfactoriness is what drives people into either psychotherapy or spiritual seeking or some other activity that they hope will address the sense of lack or insufficiency or unsatisfactoriness that almost all of us feel, at least at times. Now, psychotherapy is one thing, and speaking from what I call an awakened view of the human condition is quite another. And the question here is asking how I, Robert, from an awake perspective, assuming I have such a perspective, understands the kind of healing modalities that are employed in psychotherapy. And if those modalities are not a way of sticking one's head in the sand when it comes to our true situation as humans, psychotherapy is a healing modality that aims at addressing problems of adjustment to the world, relationships, sexuality, and feelings such as anxiety, depression, and all the rest. There are many kinds of psychotherapy. There are things as simple-minded as neuro-linguistic programming, which is basically moving an object across the vision of the client and asking that person to follow the object with her eyes or his eyes while discussing the matters that are causing the feelings of anxiety. This has actually proven effective in post-traumatic stress syndrome, and so I'm not poo-pooing it, but only want to indicate that to bring that modality into effect does not demand much of the therapist. It's a rather technical operation that's learned in a brief time and doesn't require much emotional commitment on the part of the therapist. That has nothing to do with the kind of therapy that I did when I was practicing psychotherapy. In my approach to therapy, what we call empathy is at the center. And when I say empathy, I do not mean sympathy or pity. Empathy is simply tuning in to the extent possible to the mind of another person, to the feelings and thoughts of another person, using oneself, putting oneself in the other person's shoes in order to get a feeling for what that person is going through. And in doing that, something, perhaps it can be called alchemical, can occur, not always, but often in the therapy, where without actually offering any advice or any direction, the client leaves the therapeutic situation with a different view of oneself, one that is more comfortable and makes living easier and more possible. And that's the goal of psychotherapy, is to help the client to be more comfortable in her own skin or his own skin, and to be able to deal with the vicissitudes of living in a more awake manner. This should not be confused with spiritual teaching or discussing what it means to be awake, which is a completely different proposition. And I had to, in my work, keep them well separated, because often in doing therapy, there are things that are withheld from the client so that the client can make her own or his own discoveries of those things, and not simply put on the table immediately. And this relies upon the judgment and abilities of the therapist to know when or even if those items should be presented. So perhaps the client is using spiritual bypass, for example. And for those who don't understand the term, spiritual bypass means using ideas from spirituality to avoid the actual pains and suffering that are inherent in being embodied, being an animal on the planet, which is really, in my view, undeniable. That is our basic situation. I identify, let's say, as a primate animal, a human primate animal, and without that, there's no grounding, just free to fantasize. Spiritual bypass, to take an example, involves using a spiritual idea or concept to avoid feeling the difficulty of living as a human primate animal in society. To take an example, a beloved pet is killed by a pack of dogs. One feels immediately a kind of grief and even disgust at the entire situation, the way that a beloved companion can simply be erased and never to be seen again. The non-bypass approach is to feel the grief, the sense of loss. A being you loved and enjoyed interacting with is now no longer here. And that is something to be mourned, deeply, perhaps. In spiritual bypass, the person in grief would say to herself, perhaps, well, it was God's will. We all have to die, and God chose this moment to take my pet. Now, is that true? Is it? How do we know if that's true? How do we know there's a God? Yes, as a matter of belief, there is. The word exists in the language, and some people believe that it refers to something they can understand. I'm not one of them, but that's not the point. The point here is that I use a platitude, a spiritual platitude, to try to deal with my pain. In psychotherapy, some of that may be needed and may be tolerated by the therapist and not interfered with, because we have to respect primarily the client's attitudes and beliefs and not imagine that therapy is an occasion for messing with them and changing them. It may not be. On the other hand, when I speak this way, when I speak from a perspective that I say is an awakened view of the human condition, I put all my cards on the table and I hold nothing back. So the speech here comes from Robert, and it's about Robert's mind and the way Robert sees things. In therapy, on the other hand, it's not about how Robert sees things. Robert is there to serve a function, to be therapeutic. That involves dealing not with the cards that Robert wants to put on the table, but with the cards that the client puts on the table, and that is what is considered. So I hope that helps clarify the place of empathy in psychotherapy and how an awakened view of the human condition could influence the way that therapy is practiced. Thanks a lot for the question. It's really a privilege to be able to speak this way, and I wish you all well.